28 Weeks Later is directed by Juan Carlos Fresnadillo, with screenplay by Rowan, Joffé, Juan Carlos Fresnadillo, Lavigne, and Jesus Olmo. The film stars Robbie Carlyle, Rose Byrne, Jeremy Renner, Harold Prunar, Catherine McCormack, Mackintosh, Muggleton, Imogen, Poots, and Idris Elba. According to IMDb's plot synopsis, 6 months after the rage virus was inflicted on the population of Great Britain, the U.S. Army helps to secure a small area of London for the survivors to repopulate and start again. But not everything goes according to plan. When 28 Days Later was released back in 2002 in the UK and 2003, but still roughly around that same period, it became a major influence on the zombie genre, and people saw a huge influx of zombie infected content throughout the 2000s and 2010s. When I mean that there was a big influence with regards to this film, I mean you saw a massive wave throughout those 2 decades, and they kept on making more as it went along. As for the film, people saw it as a self-contained movie until 5 years later. Nobody thought that there would be a sequel, and if so, is it still going to follow Cillian Murphy? Is it still going to follow Jim? Or Naomi Harris, Selena, Megan Burns as Hannah? This time around, it would have a new director, writers, and cast. It would follow different people this time around. It would not follow the same group that we have followed in the previous movie. As much as people loved those characters, nobody would be returning for this movie. Everyone would be replaced entirely with all new characters. Upon release, it garnered praise from critics and audiences. Everyone pretty much on board said it was a good enough sequel as it is. However, for myself, being as honest as I can be, I think it's okay. I don't think it's a terrible movie. I don't think it is awful in any way. Because while there are some aspects that are good, there are other parts that pale in comparison when you kind of put it side by side next to the first film. But before addressing them, here are the positives that I have. The performances are exceptional. Everyone in the cast kept up with the momentum of the film, keeping the movie intense. There are some really good standout performances, mainly Robert Carlyle. I think he is a really good actor in this film, and he does provide a little bit of emotional somber to his character, at least in the first half of the movie, especially in the opening. The opening to this movie is easily a good addition to the 20-layer series as a whole, but I think everyone, for the most part, I think does the best with what they are given, but they do elevate the movie to what a 28-layer film would be. The direction is thrilling. Director Juan Carlos Fresnadillo keeps the nature of Danny Boyle while infusing more chaos, all the more making it intense, bombastic, more crazier than ever now that there's a little bit more infected in this movie. I do think that Juan Carlos Fresnadillo does kind of convey the carnage and the bigger scale outbreak of what something like this could be if things were to become more on a scale where you see more infected of this nature and you see more of that. And I think it is awesome to see how many that they can have in this, but I do think that he does infuse the carnage and chaos of it all to kind of reflect a little bit more with what like an actual kind of like outbreak in the 28-layer movies would look like. The cinematography is frantic. Cinematographer Enrique Chedek throws viewers into the desperate and violent life of Great Britain. He also manages to showcase more of the infected than before. Because in the original movie, you saw a couple. You didn't see a whole lot of the infected, and you also got some really beautiful shots of Great Britain and the countryside. Here, it's mostly all self-contained in Great Britain, and it still looks amazing. It still looks gorgeous on a city level and how you see a little bit of the daily life of them trying to repopulate. But I do think the best parts are when it's showing the carnage and chaos of the infected and how crazy and scary these things can be and how versatile that they can with regards to being more rage-induced than ever before. The music is effective. Once again, composer John Murphy invokes the bleak and deadly nature of the infected, continuing on what he did from the first film. If I'm not mistaken, he does a score that is from the first movie, but he adds a little bit more of a guitar riff to it, like a much more scarier and more violent approach to that score than a more somber and bleaker type of styling, because in the first movie, you heard a lot of orchestral music and then a lot of distorted type of music where it would kind of build itself up and keep going and keep going. Whereas this feels a little bit more seamless in the sense of it doesn't feel like it's building and then just feeling to story. It feels more like a cohesive like scoring, but the guitar add element of what he did in the previous movie, I think is really good. I think it is very creepy and eerie. The production is incredible. With a budget of $15 million, the quality for it is there from the background, infected, sets and locations, and crew work. Everything comes together how you would want to expect a 28-layer movie to be. Because with this now having a little bit more of an increase in this budget, they are able to, like I said, have more infected running around and having more of a handle on not having to rush and get everything done. Even though that was, I think, the coolest part about the first movie was how much Danny Boyle and them had to pretty much shoot everything before London would open up to the public here. Of course, now that they have a little bit more leeway on this, they are able to shoot the film without having to worry about all that, but it's still a impressive feat to have a movie with only a $15 million budget to be as comparable as it is than if it wasn't. The action is stellar. Every action sequence is filled with adrenaline and horror, always making sure that the infected are still deadly. These rage-filled infected are really scary. They're very deadly. They are very much of a violent nature where they will beat and dismantle anybody that comes into contact with them, and they mean business. And some of the parts that do have them in there are very much scary. They are very much haunting on how these infected really go about getting people and how much they are able to also capture the carnage of when things can't be self-contained and locking everything down. It does keep the film at a relatively fast-paced nature when it comes to those action sequences. Beyond that, however, it doesn't come close to what the first film had, feeling more like a step down. In other words, it feels more like a sequel. It doesn't feel like this is a sequel that is earned, but rather it felt like they did it because, well, 28 Days Later was a very popular, successful film for 20th Century Fox, so they thought, all right, let's make another one. And for that, I just don't feel like it has the same charm or appeal as the first film had, so here are the negatives. The story is lackluster. Following these siblings as they survive the infected just didn't hit the same as what it was in the first film. Also, the whole finding a cure part, because there is an aspect of this movie where they do come across the whole idea of curing the rage virus, felt like a cliche to have it be a part of the plot, and one that doesn't go any further than that. It does involve that to a certain extent, but then halfway through, they just kind of abandon that and just kind of go off on a more bombastic, crazy level. And also, too, I just don't think the huge scale of what this movie is supposed to be works all that well because the beautiness of 28 Days Later was it felt more grounded, it felt more small scale, in that while it does showcase parts of London being overrun by the infected, it wasn't to a point of having so much of the feeling of, well, it's got to be bigger, grander, it's got to be much more of a spectacle, and I just don't think that was necessarily the case. And for this story, while it does have a very effective opening, I will say the opening to this day is still effective. I think it really works within the franchise that it operates in. At the same time, the rest of it, the visuals are messy. Anytime effects are used, they feel overwhelming and poorly rendered, having it all feel dated by today. Because when you look at something like 28 Days Later, the only thing I would say is the only issue for me is the audio. That was my biggest complaint. But otherwise, everything else about the movie still holds up. When I look at a movie like this, where there's visual effects, and the visual effects very much feel dated by today's standards, that kind of starts to show that it's not aged well with visual effects at all. Because the fire effects or even some of the blood splatters just don't hit the same way as how it was in that first film, because with the first movie they didn't have a bigger budget, so they now had to kind of reduce some of the gory elements, and you didn't really see a lot of kills. Here you see plenty more kills in here than you do in the first film. And while I think that sure it's cool seeing more bloody carnage, at the same time I just don't think it hit the same way as it did when not showcasing it that much. The pacing runtime is everywhere. Some scenes feel quick, others feel drawn out. With a runtime of 1 hour and 40 minutes, the results are just really inconsistent. There's never really much a certain vibe or tone in the sense of being cohesive enough for the pacing and runtime to work. And it just all felt like it was either going really, really fast when it came to those action sequences, or it really felt like it had to stop at certain moments, even though you kind of get the sense that it's supposed to be keeping things going, but it just kind of felt like at times they were really stopping the movie for like a small section, and it just kind of felt like it took longer than it needed to. The editing is jarring. Each cut is either too quick or slow, with no room for balance, making it all feel jumbled in the end. And I think what hurts the pacing runtime is also really the editing. I think it's very sloppy. I think it's done poorly a lot of the times. And while some people may say like the first movie had choppy editing, two things. One, while it was at times choppy, at the same time, it was not as much as you can never see what's going on. And two, it's a smaller scale movie. When you're low budget, you kind of have to work with what you got to do with. And plus, they had a new camera that they were working with. It was a digital camera. Here, this is all what, at the time, films were used to in terms of the camera works and tricks and whatnot. And the editing here just cannot help itself but feel like it is just snapping each time or taking way longer on scenes. So it doesn't feel like there is a balance. It feels like it is all very much inconsistent with what it's trying to go for. As a follow up to an amazing infected flick, it falls short in these areas. It was impressive on how much infected they were able to add and dialing up the intensity for them, but ultimately it hurts itself on parts that it shouldn't have. And again, it's a sequel. It's always bound to happen when a sequel tries to be much bigger than it is or tries to be like the first movie, but just trying to make sure it still feels a little bit bigger than it is. I just don't think for a movie that is coming off of the success of a very acclaimed film with huge influence, I just feel like this, as much as it's a sequel, it just kind of feels like what you see a lot of times in the genre as a whole, or rather at the time, what a lot of zombie infected flicks were doing, and it just doesn't stand out amongst the crowd. And for this to be a sequel to a very influential movie, it just kind of feels strange and weird, especially with how this plot is. Yeah, it all feels off. I'm gonna give 28 Weeks Later a 6 out of 10. I think it's okay. It's fine for what it is, and I don't think it necessarily ruins everything that 28 Days Later did, but it just felt, for a movie that is supposed to be a follow-up to a very influential film, you would think that the sequel could at least, I wouldn't say recapture everything, but rather still keep the things and still make it feel as if it's special in that way. Because when you see the movies in like a franchise or a trilogy, you kind of expect it to have this. And here, it just kind of felt like it's trying to keep some of the things from the original, but trying to upscale how it all looks and how it feels. And for me, it just doesn't always stick the landing in that regard. And it just kind of feels like it's another infected flick. That's all it is. It just doesn't stand out amongst the crowd. So I will be soon doing a review for 28 Years Later very soon. So yes, look forward to that review and other reviews coming soon.